Welcome everyone to session 5 of our virtual learning series, Foundations in Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy for Social Workers. My name is Heidi Allen. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Associate Professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work. Tonight's topic is safety and consent in psychedelic-assisted therapy. This learning series is brought to you by the Psychedelic Therapy Training Program at the Columbia University School of Social Work in partnership with the Penn School of Nursing, with generous funding from the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation and the Joe and Sandy Sandberg Foundation.
And hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Stott. I'm the program manager for the Psychedelic Therapy Training Program here at the Columbia School of Social Work. And just a few administrative notes. As a reminder, this learning series is not intended to be a comprehensive training in providing psychedelic-assisted therapy, but to initiate dialogue and start building foundational knowledge in the field of social work. Notably, for the first time, we have a specific pharmacological drug paired with a specific therapy model under review for approval by the FDA. As social workers make up the largest segment of mental health providers in the United States, it's critical that our clients will have access to these emerging innovations in clinical practice. Also to note, with the exception of ketamine, these therapies are not yet available in the US outside of a research setting. We are bringing you this content with the anticipated FDA rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin in the coming years. With that, I'd like to introduce our guest moderator for this evening. Andrea Simoya Sosa is a second-year MSW student interested in becoming a psychedelic therapist. Her bachelor's degree is in psychology, and most of her professional background has been in some type of academic research setting. Research is something she continues to be passionate about, and in addition to becoming a psychedelic therapist, she's also interested in being involved in research on psychedelics and use that to influence positive policy changes. Andrea's hope with psychedelics is to use them to heal trauma, as well as ending the racist war on drugs in order to work towards a more socially just world. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrea.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I am super excited to introduce Emma Knighton, MA LMHC, and she goes by she, they pronouns. And Emma is a white, queer, able-bodied femme with lineage rooted in Celtic Druidry. In their clinical work, Emma works at the intersection of complex PTSD from childhood abuse, queer identity development, and consciousness exploration. Her clinical and leadership approach is grounded in queer, consent, feminist, and anti-oppression/pro-liberation theories. Emma teaches courses on integrating trauma-attuned consent practices into psychedelic-assisted therapy and strives to be in service to the psychedelic space with integrated mind, body, spirit, and community. Emma does organizing work in the psychedelic ecosystem around equity, access, and integrating liberation practices and the spirit of the medicine into organizational strategy and operations. A lifelong learner, Emma is in sacred relationship with their ancestors, tree elders, plant teachers, and the collective consciousness.
And with that, Emma, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. Heidi, Brooke, Andrea. Hello, participants. Nice to see you. I am going to introduce myself a little bit further. There's some things I like to say before talking about consent and safety that feel really important just to orient you to me and to that we're going to talk about. So again, Emma Knighton, she, they pronouns. My preference is for them to be used interchangeably. And I'm speaking to you today from the unceded ancestral lands of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people. And, some of my identities were shared, but just to reiterate, I'm white, I'm queer, I'm able-bodied, I'm a femme, and my ancestry is very Irish, and it's a big part of my identity. I come from a lineage of Celtic Druids. And I really recognize that my white, cisgender, and straight passing, even if that's not my identity, my non-parolee, native English-speaking, able-bodied and thin privileges have allowed me to access higher education and career opportunities that are centered to white English speakers. And that is part of the context of me even being here today. We're going to talk today mostly about consent practices. We're also going to talk about trauma and safety in psychedelic-assisted therapy. and just wanting to really uplift that power inequity and systemic oppression are real forms of trauma, some of which I will never and can never experience due to my lived experiences, my identities, and that, I hold myself accountable to the work of dismantling those oppressive patterns within myself, and recognize that I will not accomplish that in my lifetime. It's something I will never finish. And I've benefited from the labor and the trauma of BIPOC teachers, friends, strangers, mentors, and continue to benefit from the systems that perpetuate those cycles of trauma. And just want to be really clear, I'll say this a couple of times throughout the presentation as well, but most of the wisdom in this presentation comes from queer, kink, and sex work communities, some of which I'm a part of, some of which I'm not. And just really wanted to recognize the criminalized, violent, and traumatic histories of these communities, and uplift and honor the living fight for queer, kink, and sex work liberation in our society that is incredibly queer-phobic, sex negative, and kink shaming. And just recognizing it's the life, labor, and love of these communities that even allow me to be here and speak on these topics today, and that it's my privileges that protect me from some retribution for speaking out about this and uplifting the work of these incredible communities. So just wanted to represent them with a lot of love and honor and celebration, and pay respect to the people that I don't share identities with, that their wisdom is coming into this presentation here. Okay, so safety and consent in psychedelic-assisted therapy. That's what we're talking about today. We're going to have most of this be specified on consent, but we're going to touch on safety a little bit first, and safety is woven in throughout the whole thing. So, when we're working with expanded states, like come up with psychedelics, there's a need for higher attention to the ethics of consent and power dynamics. Safety is fluid and exists within the context of the relational container within psychedelic-assisted therapy. When I say relational container, what that means is the relationship between the practitioner or practitioners and the client or clients, right? So the thing that is holding the work that we're doing. And these pieces that are around these words, relational container, are just some aspects of safety, and wanting to name that these are what exists outside of medical safety. So we're not going to be talking about things like drug dosing or interactions or contraindications today, but specifically more around these other types of safety that really highlight emotional, physical, and psychological and spiritual well-being. And so just really naming that psychedelics open us up, right? A piece of the intention and a piece of why they actually work so well for healing is that they take survival mechanisms offline in some ways. They turn down the parts of our brain, especially folks with trauma, that are being overworked, that are being overused, that are coming up and getting in the way of people being able to function and live lives the way they want to. And so what that means is that, these things, these structures that are put in place to keep us safe, to protect us, even if they are over-functioning or coming from a place of trauma, are decreased. And so someone is much more open, much more vulnerable in these states. And that gives a lot of power and responsibility to the practitioner that's in the room. So the practitioner has to be much more highly attuned to things like privilege and oppression, touch, human connection, and the attachment that shows up in the relational space, the general vulnerability and suggestibility that clients have when they're in this state, and the trauma histories and the trauma energy that is moving through the room and through the bodies, both of the practitioner and of the client. And so all of this is to say that these are things that we're going to dive into these in a deeper way, that we have to be more attuned, we have to be more conscious of consent, we have to be more conscious of ethics than we would in session situations where we are not inviting molecules in that expand our consciousness. All these things we have to be incredibly attuned to anyways, but it increases once psychedelics get on board. So we're going to talk mainly about a framework that I've developed and call it trauma-attuned consent. And we're really focusing on the how. So I'm not going to ad nauseum talk to you about all of the ethical violations that have happened in the field, all of the issues around safety. Those are well documented online. Feel free to look them up. We're going to talk about what do we do about it and how do we actually help create safety and a very highly consent-oriented relationship within psychedelic therapy. So trauma-attuned consent, the definitions that I work from is that it's an embodied process of co-creating an agreement centered on negotiations of desires, limits, and risks. And it is how we grapple with the reality that we're all capable of harming each other, and we all have stories of being harmed living in our bodies, both our own stories of harm and our ancestors' stories of harm. And this framework has its roots in kink and sex work lineages. All of my training around consent comes from either the kink world or the sex work world. And there's a really high overlap in these worlds because there's really vulnerable states that in the kink world, we're working in incredibly vulnerable states. Sex work is an incredibly vulnerable state. And these are the communities that have really written the book on consent. And so we need to look to them as we're really thinking about how do we make sure that this place that we're working in has a high container of consent in where we're interplaying with trauma and something that is so vulnerable and healing at the same time. So we're going to do a quick rundown of basic theory of consent. This is from Betty Martin. There's a lot of words on this page. Betty requires that when we share this exact document. So we're going to dive in a little bit, but this resource is available online for free on her website. So Betty Martin is a sex worker, and she passes this down through sex workers are all teachers of this, and then there's trainings for practitioners of all sorts. So highly recommend looking up her work. And she develops and teaches this all over the world now. So this is a really helpful framework when we're looking at consent and how to really create consensual negotiations in relationship with someone else, and applies really well to places like practitioner practice, whether it's just general therapy, but specifically psychedelic-assisted therapy. So I'm not going to go over all of this. We're just going to zoom in on the things that we need here. But just to give you a sense of how this works, the wheel is broken up into two different questions. One question is who's doing the action? And the other question is who is it for? So if you look on here, we've got, if you're doing the action, you're in these quadrants. If the other person is doing it, it's in these quadrants. If it's for you, you're over here. If it's for the other person, you're over here. So looking at this, if you're in the serve quadrant, that means that you are doing something that is for somebody else. Every practitioner, therapist, social worker, we're all in serve most of the time. We are doing things that is for somebody else, right? If I'm giving my partner and my dog a massage, I'm in serve. Take quadrant here is when you are doing an action, but it's for you. So this is if I say, ooh, like your jacket looks really fuzzy. Can I rub your jacket? It's going to feel good on my hands. I am doing something that is for me. And so I'm taking. Okay, if we go to the accept quadrant, this is where you are receiving. So someone else is doing the action, but it's for me, right? So if I'm getting a back massage, someone else is giving me a back massage, but it's for my own pleasure and benefit. And then allow over here is that someone else is doing the action to me and it's for them. Okay, so if I have a fuzzy jacket on and Heidi comes up to me and is like, oh, I really want to touch that jacket. That looks nice. And I say, yeah, go ahead. I'm allowing Heidi to do that. So if you can see here, there's arrows that connect these. So serve and accept go together, take and allow go together. And again, we're going to be really highlighting in serve and accept because this is the space that all practitioners should be in at all times. But a big reason why we talk about this is that practitioners have to learn what take feels like in order for their serve to be clean. Because the boundary between these two gets really fuzzy really quickly when power dynamics and expanded states come online. Because we're all human and we all have things that we want. And there's reasons that each of us are in the space of wanting to be or being a psychedelic therapist. It's not truly altruism. We're getting something out of it as well. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. And so we need to be aware of what those motivations are and be able to keep them in check and be aware of our own trauma patterns and how those might show up that might push us into a place of doing something that's for us instead of doing something that is actually for the other person. The other thing to highlight here, and you can look at this more, and Betty has tons of videos online, is that there's a shadow side of each of these. So the idea here is that these kind of interactions are ethical, are consensual when they're happening within the wheel, when they are agreed upon, when they've been negotiated to, and there's a co-created consensual container that everyone knows can change at any time because consent is fluid and it is never just you say once, yes once, and then you're good forever. There's a constant checking in that needs to happen. All of these dynamics can happen outside of consent. And there's shadow pieces that are shadows of each side. And the thing that I want to highlight here is the shadow of allow. So this is probably hard to see, but in the shadow allow, the idea is you're enduring something, you're pushing through something. There's a lot of victim mentality that comes along with that. There's a passivity to it. And all of us, every single person on this call right now is trained to be in the shadow allow. We all know what it feels like to endure touch that we don't want. Every single one of us as children was touched without our consent. Many people here were touched in violent ways without consent. Our society does not support consent-oriented interaction. And so we all know what it feels like to endure something that we don't want to have happen. Your clients are going to come in to your sessions ready to be in the shadow of allow. Clients want to please their therapists, their social workers, their practitioners. So we need to be aware that clients are primed for this, and we need to put extra effort into teaching clients how to be in accept. So the way to keep a client out of the shadow of allow is to teach them what it feels like to be in accept, teach them what it feels like to have someone cleanly in serve. The other thing to know about this is that when we're in a shadow of one of these dynamics, we project the other person into the associated shadow of the other side. So if somebody is in the shadow of allow, and maybe that's because of their trauma history, something feels familiar, practitioner isn't actually in the shadow of take, they're in serve. The client is in the shadow of allow, so they're going to project their practitioner into the shadow of take, which means that in the client's experience, something unethical is happening. Something is happening that is not in consent. And that is a massive risk for a practitioner. And so it's both protective for clients to teach people what consent feels like, how it feels to be in a truly serve-accept dynamic, and it's also protective for practitioners. And so this is a part of building that relational container and why we need to take the time and space to really be attuned to what's happening and how consent moves through the relationship between us and our clients. Okay, what else here? Just the other thing to say before we move on, there's lots in this. Again, I'm just giving you a brief overview here, is that when we're looking at privilege, we're looking at oppression, when we're looking at like patterns of power abuse that flow through our bodies, it's really helpful to learn what it feels like to be in take, to know what does it actually feel like for my body to be doing something to somebody else that is for me, because that's how oppressive patterns typically move through for people in power positions. Oftentimes we're doing something to someone else that is for the benefit of ourselves. And so we can learn what that feels like in our body and be able to attune to, oh, maybe maybe my internalized white supremacy is coming up here. Maybe I'm moving through a space that power doesn't feel actually like consented to here. And knowing somatically how that arises in your body is going to help you be able to notice when it's coming up and help you move out of that and come back into a place of serve. So again, a really key thing here is that for practitioners, you have to learn how to be in take in order for your serve to be clean. And for most of us, we're helpers, we're caretakers. It's hard for us to be in take. And so I really encourage people to practice this, watch Betty's videos and practice with loved ones, friends, what it feels like to be in take so that you know, so that if you start to shift into that when you're with clients, you can be aware of it and move yourself back cleanly into that serve quadrant where you are doing something that is purely for your client and it's not for you. Okay, let's keep going. So just to break this down, this is a little bit usually easier to digest for people. When we're making agreements with clients or really with anybody around consent, there's 4 pieces that we need to be attuned to. So the first is what's happening. What is the thing that is going to happen? What are the desires? That's the person who is for. What do they want to happen? And what are the limits? That's the person who is doing the thing. It's not for that person, but they're allowed to have boundaries. What are their limits? So we're going to negotiate. I want this. Okay, I have a limit around this. Let's figure out what can actually happen that's inside of consent for both of us. And then we want to break it down even more. Who's doing the action? Okay, I am going to be giving you a hand massage. Who's it for? For you? Cool. I'm in serve, you're in accept. When or how will it stop? This is really important, especially when we're talking about touch in psychedelic therapy. Oftentimes we're just like, clients like, hold my hand, and you hold their hand. And then there gets to a point where the client's like, I don't want them to hold my hand anymore, but I feel uncomfortable. Do I pull it away? Do I not? Talking about it ahead of time, and we're going to get more into this in a moment, and practicing like, hey, okay, so if we have touch, it's going to stop. Either you're going to pull away, I'm going to pull away, or just quick before we hold hands, I'm going to say to you, is there a time limit? how are we going to do this here? Like, you're going to pull away, I'm going to pull away. Cool. Just like a quick negotiation of being clear so that nobody in the interaction is being pushed into that shadow of allow of now I'm here. I'm enduring this thing that I don't actually want and doesn't actually feel safe for my body anymore. So we go through these agreements. And then just a reminder, I actually don't think I said this before, but for serve accept, the question is, will you? So the person in accept is saying, will you hold my hand? Okay. And take allow, it's may I, because I'm doing something that is for me. So may I give you a massage? It's for me. I'm going to enjoy it, whatever the thing is. And a big reminder here is that when we're negotiating around consent, the person giving the gift, so that's the person in serve or that's the person in allow, is responsible for tracking and expressing their own limits throughout. So if you're in serve, if you're a therapist, social worker working in psychedelic therapy, it is constantly your responsibility to be attuned to your own boundaries and your own limits, because the moment you are moved outside of a space of consent, when you're pushed up against one of your boundaries, that is automatically going to break the consensual container that you created with your clients. And now both of you are in the shadow of something. Okay. So we're going to keep going. So this now, what we're going to look at is essentially we're going to go through this checklist. So this is what I offer to people, and there's 2 pages of this to go through during preparation sessions with clients, and then to return to over and over again if you're working with someone continuously in integration sessions. And a reminder again that consent is a fluid, alive thing. It's ongoing. It can change at any time. And so these are things that we need to be checking in with as we navigate a relationship with other clients. And just to say, this is in addition to the usual informed consent form that covers things like confidentiality, dosing, scope of practice, et cetera, those things that we're used to and get trained on. This is a enhanced consent process. So I'm not going to go over normal informed consent things, but know that that's important too still. So this is more in the roots of the comes from kink and BDSM negotiation training. So Betty Martin's work is more of that sex work lineage, and this is more kink lineage. So we're just going to run through these and I'll explain each of them, and then we're going to have time for questions at the end. So the first thing here is that we need to be assessing clients' relationships to yes and no. What this means is that all of us have a different relationship to consent. Many, we're not trained consent in our society. Many people have trauma around having their consent violated. And at the base, most of us have the trauma of not knowing that consent is important and not knowing what it actually looks like to be in a truly consensual relationship with other people and with the planet and animals. And so assessing clients' relationship to yes and no, what this can look like is talking about it. There's an embodied assessment that I do with people, which is where you have people like get in their body as much as that is able, is accessible for them based on trauma histories and dissociation, and slowing down and just saying the words yes and no in a really slow, like breath-oriented way, and just noticing what happens, right? Some people are yeses come out really quickly and they're not grounded. Some people are no's, it gets really awkward and shaky. So just we need to know what people's relationship to is with even saying yes and no to things. Are we people pleasers? Are we someone who has really high rigidity around certain things? And the reason we need to know this is that, like, for me, I need to know what the baseline is of how someone is relating to consent in a session without any medicine on board, because I need to be able to trust that when we are in session, someone's going to be able to say no to me. They're going to be able to say yes to me, because I can't, for me, my baseline is that someone has to be able to have at least a awareness of their body while they say yes and no to even do medicine with people. Because otherwise it's setting us up for a space where someone is going to say yes to something because they're primed to want to please me. And then that's going to potentially put them into a re-traumatized state based on whatever's going on. Or there's just not going to be able to actually have negotiation around touch if that's something that's available. And to me, that's an unsafe space for anybody to be in and ripe for ethical violations. So during preparation sessions, we need to talk about what someone's relationship to consent is and how it feels to say yes or no between us in the space. And you can practice it. And that's something we'll talk about in a moment. So we need to be discussing power dynamics that are present in the relationship and consenting to the risk that is involved. So what that means is that what does safe enough to engage in whatever medicine it is look like? So safe period, I don't think exists. but safe enough does exist. So when we look at in kink negotiation, imagine that you're doing like a negotiation for a bondage scene. What does safe enough to participate in some level of rope play look like? What are your risk factors? What is your safety profile? What are the power moving between us? And what are the power dynamics that are present that we need to be attuned to in order to prioritize safety and acknowledge the risk that is present? So for me, for example, I am a white person. And when I work with people of color, it's important to name that there's a power dynamic moving between us. White supremacy and racism is very real in our world. And even if I've done a lot of work on it, again, I'm never going to completely unlearn my own white supremacy, and my whiteness will always be with me, which means that there is a risk for clients of color who are working with me. My whiteness could come up in a session, and there could be microaggressions and there could be harm done to them. And that's something they need to be aware of and needs to be talked about in session before we bring medicine into the mix. For me also, I'm queer, I'm kinky, I'm polyamorous. There are spaces of marginalized identities that I hold. And when I've worked with therapists who don't hold those same identities, there's risk for me. And even people who do hold those same identities, there's risk because there's inter-community issues and marginalization. And I need to know where someone's at in relationship to these things that could harm me when they are representative of power dynamics that are really oppressive within our world and society. And so the idea here is not that we're going to get to a place of total safety. The idea is that we're consenting to the risk that is present in different ways, whether it's power dynamics, touch, trauma, all the different things that are going to be present in these really vulnerable containers. And also just another piece of this is that when we look back at the wheel of consent, something that one of my teachers in that space really hits home is that our access, the amount of access that we have to choice in our life, which is specifically connected to our social location and our relationship to power and privilege. So our access to choice determines the amount of access to consent that we have. If we are living in a world we don't have a lot of access to choice, then we are trained that we don't get to consent to things, that things just happen to us. And we don't get to say yes, we don't get to say no, we don't have the power, the social resource or financial resource or just resource in general to be able to choose. And so we need to be aware of where someone is at in relationship to the power dynamics to be able to assess like how much ability to consent does this person even have? What kind of relationship do they have to that? And how is that going to show up in terms of what I'm representing with my identities in the space between us? So this next piece, doing a trauma assessment and identify trigger points that come up. Again, this is not going to be exhaustive. We're never going to be able to have a couple prep sessions and be like, let's think about everything that could possibly happen. We're going to get surprised. And a part of the reason that we put so much effort and insistent on consent during the prep sessions is that hopefully we're creating a container that has enough trust to be able to deal with stuff that's uncertain and surprises that come up in a way that is safe and negotiable. But it is good to do an assessment ahead of time to know what kind of things could pop up during this. What could I do as a practitioner that might trigger you? Tell me about what you're dealing with in your life. Tell me what you want to work on. Show me with your body how it reacts or how it feels when you experience whatever the thing is that you want to change, right? So gaining a sense of what the client's body looks like when they're triggered, when their trauma is coming up. So that when we're in the medicine session, you can be attuned and tracking the client's body for those triggers and for those trauma responses that you have talked about and seen during prep sessions. And again, you're going to be surprised. There's going to be things that happen that show up that you didn't talk about ahead of time, and that's okay. But just trying to build your understanding of the client's nervous system and how it relates to the things that you're going to be working with in the session. So the next piece that we do is we identify hard and soft boundaries for the client and the practitioner. I talk about this most in terms of touch because this is, the thing that there's most ethical violations around. But this is also related to other things that we'll talk about as well, but I'm going to specifically talk about with touch. So a hard boundary is a firm no. A hard boundary is the outermost line of where we can interact. Something I like to tell people and remind people often is that boundaries are actually about how we invite people in to something. Many people think boundaries are about keeping someone out. That's actually not the case. Boundaries are where we say, we draw this line and we say, this is the space within which we can authentically connect. This is the space in which we can be vulnerable and have a love-based connection that's based in love and mutual respect and understanding. And so me giving someone a boundary is giving a gift and saying, here, I want to connect with you. And this is the line within which we can do it. So our hard boundaries are our furthest outline. So touch, we always have to check in, is touch a hard boundary? Like if touch is a hard boundary, then cool, no touch is happening in this session. And that's something we check in with over and over again with clients. If touch is a soft boundary, then we go into negotiation and understanding what kind of touch is available. So a hard boundary is hard, no, cool, nothing's happening regarding to that. Soft boundary is there's room to negotiate. And there's room to negotiate in prep sessions usually, and then sometimes within the actual medicine session as well. And to say that this is important for clients and practitioners. Practitioners' hard boundaries are actually the furthest most outline, right? Our boundaries, if we're outside of our boundaries, the whole consent container is blown. So we have to decide, am I comfortable touching clients? And if a client comes in and says, I really need you to be able to hold my hand, I really need a hug. If you're not comfortable with that, then that's not a person that's safe for you to work with, and you're not a safe practitioner for them. So then that's a space where we need to refer to somebody else who does have a soft boundary around touch, and that is accessible for them in their practice. Another thing to think about for yourself as a practitioner is, what are your boundaries around self-disclosure? In psychedelic sessions, people are much more open, boundaries are dropped in many ways. You are going to be impacted by the medicine that's in the room, even if you didn't ingest it yourself, but the energy of that impacts your bodies, and we feel more open to. Clients like to ask questions about us. They want to know in, like standard consciousness, people know kind of not to ask, but I'm telling you, you get medicine on board and those boundary gets blown and they want to know who you are. And that's fine. And that's beautiful. You need to decide what your level of comfortability is with sharing things about yourself with clients, so that you can be clear about what boundaries you have going into it. Talking about sexual energy, it's very common for sexual energy to come up during psychedelic sessions, and you just have to decide how you work with it. Is that something that do you have a boundary around people experiencing that with you in the room? Are you going to step out? Are you, what's going to happen? There's lots of different ways that can work. Obviously, a hard boundary is no sexual engagement with clients in these spaces, but oftentimes there's room for sexual energy to move through our second chakra without having any kind of sexual engagement. And that can be triggering for some practitioners. So we need to know what our boundaries are around that and be able to communicate that clearly. Another thing is like aggressive energy coming out. If someone has a lot of anger that they need to move through their system, what does that look like? What's okay for the practitioner? What's not okay for the practitioner? Are they okay with screaming, yelling, punching things? I have a close friend and colleague who has a really strong boundary with somebody of, you don't get to break anything in my office. There's a whole bunch of stuff you get to hit and you get to kick, but you don't get to break anything. And you were going to agree to that ahead of time. So just really going through this and understanding where the boundaries are for the practitioner and then where the boundaries are for the client, and what they need in that space, and then being able to practice it and agree to it for down the road. Okay, so then safe words, again, comes directly from the BDSM world. We need to agree on verbal safe words and non-verbal safe words with clients. Verbal safe words, my safe word is pineapple. Feel free to use it. Apparently it's a very common one. I always have like 4 people be like, that's mine too. And red, stop, right? Something that someone can say that is a very, very clear, everything stops. If it's touch, if it's some kind of intervention, whatever it is, everything is stopping when that verbal word is said. Nonverbal safe word, these are important because oftentimes with psychedelics, people get into nonverbal states, especially at higher doses with things like psilocybin. Ketamine is really common for people to get into nonverbal states. Nonverbal safe words, we need these because with psychedelic states, people can get into nonverbal states pretty easily. And so things like a certain hand movement, I've had clients where they'll say, okay, I'm going to hold on to a ball, I'm going to drop it, something like that. A lot of people will do, the most common is this, of just waving your hand. So just having something that's agreed on. These are not used very often, but it's good to have it there so that clients know that there is something that is the off switch. So then we come back to touch here. So if touch is a soft boundary, so what that means again is that if someone has said, okay, touch is okay, it's not a hard boundary, but I'm not sure how it wants to move, then we need to practice. So clients' bodies need to have an experience of making physical contact with their practitioner in preparation sessions. What this does is that it breaks the barrier that we're so used to in these professional spaces of not touching each other. And it gives the body a somatic memory of what it feels like to be in touch connection with their practitioner. So we go through these different pieces. So we practice accepting. So when the practitioner says, would you like me to hold your hand? And you practice the client saying, yes, I would like that. And you do that by, you say, okay, I want you to pause. I want you to check in, and I want you to see if there's a yes there. If there is, say it, then we're going to do it. Okay. We're going to have that little, like, when does it stop conversation? We're going to have it stop. We're going to process, check in. How was that? How'd that feel? We're going to do that with declining. So same thing. I'm going to offer, would you like me to hold your hand? Client's going to pause, check in. If there's a no, find a no. They're going to say no. And then they're going to have an experience of me respecting their boundary. Okay. So then the piece of, I think we're on accepting and then declining. So the important thing here is that we want the client's body to have an experience of their practitioner respecting their boundaries. So what that means is, for accepting and declining, we want the client to have the experience of saying, yes, I want you to hold my hand. Actually, now I've changed my mind and no, I don't want you to anymore. And doing that without medicine on board creates a somatic memory so that they know, okay, this person is trustworthy. I have an experience of them respecting these boundaries, and it's going to increase that trust and increase that ability to consent to the risk that's present when we're moving into medicine sessions. So same thing. Then we go through declining and accepting, requesting. So when client says, will you hold my hand? Having them experience the therapist saying yes to that, and negotiating. So negotiating is something like if a client maybe says, I need you to lay your full body on top of me, which is a thing that happens. And if your boundaries around that you established are that that's not okay. For example, if we're working within Oregon in the 109 model, which maybe some of you are familiar with, some of you are not, there's boundaries from the government around touch, which says you can hold a hand, you can hold feet, you can touch their shoulder, you can give them a hug. You can't lay your full body on a client. So if someone's asking for that, you need to practice negotiating. So what I would do in that scenario is I would say, okay, I'm going to give you a pillow and I want you to hug that pillow, or I'm going to push my hands on top of the pillow to give you that weight. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to say, here's what I can offer. Here's my limit. Does that work? What do you want here? Like, can we get to something that fulfills the same need that you're having, that you're asking for this from, while staying within our negotiated limits and the boundaries that we've set? Another thing, just to name for people, I always get this question, so I just try to answer it ahead of time, is that what do you do if somebody has set a hard boundary around consent in the prep session, and then you get into the medicine session and they're like, oh my God, actually, I just really need a hug. Oh my God, I'm open now and I really would love some touch. I wasn't touched as a kid and I've, but this is what I'm working on and I just think this would be really helpful. I know I said no to it in our prep session, but can you please just hold my hand? This happens. What I do in that situation, and this is different practitioners will say different things, but for me, I am never going to violate the agreement that I have made with somebody with their ordinary consciousness self. So I'm a parts work therapist. I think about it from that perspective. In psychedelic therapy, protector parts oftentimes are not present. So that means that I've committed to a certain part of them that I'm going to hold a boundary. If I violate that, I've then violated the agreement that I made with another part of the client, which is part of the client that exists in the world most of the time. So if this happens, I will remind them, hey, actually, remember during our preparation sessions, we made an agreement. You set a firm boundary with me that we weren't going to do any touch. I really hear that you want this now. Can we experience together what it's like to have that desire, to want to be touched? What does it feel like in your body to actually want this? This is something you didn't want before. This is a big deal. Is there some self-touch that maybe we could do, right? Is there maybe a pillow or something else that could give you that same level of soothing? Is there something I could say or some kind of positioning with our bodies where we're not touching that would help you, right? Like negotiating around what is the need? How do we try to get it met? And if we can't, can we acknowledge that desire is there? And then I always commit, we're going to talk about this in integration. And if we're going to do another session, we can change our boundaries at that point. But we're going to talk about this when we're both in the same level of consciousness, and we can renegotiate, and maybe hand holding does become an option for our next medicine session. But we're never blowing past the agreements of consent that we made when the client was in consciousness ordinary consciousness. And another piece underneath this is just to say that we can't consent to things when we're under the influence of anything. And so we have to abide by whatever was agreed upon before altering medicines are on board. So again, a little controversial. Some people have different opinions, but that's mine. So this next one, developing a plan for total revocative consent for therapy after dosing, and then going over with support person. So all of the research studies make people sign something that says once they have taken the medicine, they're not going to leave the room. They're not going to leave the setting. From my opinion, I think that that can get up to issues around consent. Specifically, my experience with this has come from being in training settings where specifically Black clinicians have asked what happens if a Black client is working with a white client and they have like serious racialized trauma come up, or if there's microaggressions happening, what do you do? That person is not safe anymore. They need to leave. I've been in 3 different trainings where someone has asked that question and the person training has not had an answer. And so I put this on here not to say that I have the answer, but this is something we need to think about. And it's not just racialized trauma, right? That's just the example that I use because that's the example that I learned this from. But there are other things that are present too. If someone is unsafe, if a practitioner is doing something that doesn't feel okay or is harming them, we need to have a plan for what's going to happen. What I do with clients is that I say, okay, we're going to have a support person. You're going to have a support person that can be here within 20 minutes. And if you are totally revoking your consent for therapy, we're going to call that person. I'm going to sit outside the room. The door is going to be open and that person's going to come. I'm going to sit where there's still view, right? If there's other people, if you have another therapist, that's a whole nother thing. If other people could come in. But then we need to go over that plan with support person and really negotiate and get into details of what does it look like? Is that support person staying here? Are you leaving? Right. And this is all dependent too on whatever space you're working with, both like federal government, state regulations, and also the regulations of your clinic or practice is going to influence what this looks like. But just knowing that it's something that you need to talk about with clients because it can happen. So consent to the medicine room setup and the objects present. Clients need to feel autonomy over the space that they're in, right? I think everyone knows the importance of set and setting for medicine work. And so what I do is I have clients look around and I say, how do you feel about what's in here? Do you want to change the setup? Like anything you want to move, any objects you want to bring, anything you want out of here, right? What do you need this space to look like, to feel like in order to feel safe enough to engage here? Another thing about objects, and this, I do some work around religious trauma within the LGBTQIA2S+ community and the intersection of that with psychedelics, of that people, a lot of practitioners will have various spiritual iconography present in their room. It can be incredibly triggering to someone with religious trauma and also to other people as well. So something to think about if you are a practitioner, if you need your Buddha statue in the room, who is that for? That's for you. That's not for your client. And so what I recommend to people is just take it out in general. You can have your own practices in you. You don't need that statue in your room unless you're working with 100% Buddhist clients. But other sorts of things like that, and giving clients a chance to say, this doesn't work for me. This doesn't work for me. I need you to remove this. I need you to remove this. I want to bring my own stuff, right? And then the therapist needs to think about, is that within their space of consent to have the client's spiritual, religious artifacts, iconography present as well. Same thing for rituals. A lot of people like to do different kind of rituals. There's lots of practitioners that like to smudge clients, use tarot cards, like all sorts of things. You really need to think about and consent to those before they happen and make sure that it's something that the client is willing and wanting to have in their space. And again, that comes back to that question of who is this for? And that ethical practitioners, we always need to be in serve, which means that it is for the client. It is not for us. If it's for us, we're in take. Okay, and then making an aftercare plan. So aftercare, it's a word that comes from the kink community again. Aftercare just means what happens after the really vulnerable experience is done or the end of it. So someone is coming down, they're down from their medicine. What does that end of the piece look like? Are we going to have some food together? Are we going to have quiet music? Are you going to go into an integration room? Are we going to do some art? Like, what does that look like? Are there needs that are there? Are you allergic to any food? Do you have dietary restrictions, right? These sorts of things, we want to plan what the end of the day is going to look like as much as we can, knowing that there's going to be surprises. We can't plan for everything, but want to be as intentional about it as possible. And practitioners need aftercare too. Your aftercare exists after your client leaves, but you need to have a plan for what that looks like for you as well. Holding space for psychedelic sessions is exhausting in many ways. It's also very fulfilling. It can be, and it's a long day. So what does it look like for you to take care of yourself? How do you release the energy that's in your body, both from your stuff that has come up in the room, because that's going to happen. Clients are going to trigger your stuff and you need to be able to work with that, and from your client stuff that you are taking on. If we're not taking care of ourselves as practitioners, then we're not ethical practitioners. And so it's really important to make sure that you have that aftercare set up for you as well. Okay. That's all of the lecture-y stuff that I have to go through. And we can open it up for questions, and thank you for everyone bearing with me around the internet.
Go ahead and start the Q&A now. If you have any questions, you can just throw it in the Q&A and I'll just answer them in the order that they pop up. Our first question is, how much of these protocols are currently being implemented in clinical studies, such as the well-known ones at Hopkins? A lot of the footage of these studies show the therapist holding the participants' hands.
Yeah, great question. So these protocols, none of them have been implemented, at least in this framework from me. Some MAPS has started to train people on practicing touch ahead of time. And so I know in those studies, they're starting to do that. To my knowledge, it was not part of the research protocol for them to practice touch ahead of time in those studies. I know, again, they're starting to do it now, but most of them, that wasn't happening.
Thank you so much. Our next question is there any written work as yet about parts work and psychedelic work, e.g. understanding more about what happens to parts when using the medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of people have been interested in the intersection of IFS, internal family systems, which is one branch of the parts work tree, with psychedelics. And so Dick Schwartz from IFS, there's a lot of talks that he's done about that intersection there. And also to say that IFS has a lot of roots in shamanism and shamanism practice. And so looking to indigenous communities around ideas of parts and presences in terms of psychedelics as well is a really good resource for that. For me personally, what I've seen in this space is that psychedelics amplify parts and also create room for them to integrate with each other. It also calms down protector parts and gives access to inner children in a way that can be really hard to access in ordinary state therapy work. And so I would say for anybody who wants to work with trauma, specifically people who have like significant trauma histories, having some understanding of parts work is really, really helpful, especially with MDMA. MDMA tends to bring out parts for trauma reprocessing, and the attachment trauma really can be helped with MDMA, and oftentimes is played out with the practitioners. We see that in some of the videos from the MAPS trainings. And so having a sense of how to hold that and move with that as a practitioner is really important. The MAPS training doesn't specifically train you in that. You'll see it in the videos, but getting in some extra training can be helpful. And a lot of the training programs now do teach some aspect of that, of what that looks like.
Am I just a follow-up question on that? Are you talking about like archetypal roles that like the individual might put the person in, or can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So yes and no, it kind of depends on what lens you're looking at. But oftentimes like the practitioner will get put into the role of a parent, right? Or the role of somebody who either like harmed the person or the person who didn't give the care afterwards, right? So trauma is often not about the event that happens. It's about what happens or doesn't happen after the event. And so frequently people will replay those experiences and have to like redo them in relationship with the practitioner in the room. Also to say that it's not always like now your mom. But it also can be that a part comes out and is talking to you, and they need somebody to be that like steady, stable, secure attachment container to be able to work through whatever it is. It doesn't mean that you are in a projection. It just means that you are the safe, grounded person in the room that part can work through it with. From the IFS lens, the therapist is a part of the system and is representing what's called self energy. And it's like the kind of grounded, authentic self, core self, some other people call it, that the therapist is oftentimes in that role until the client has developed it themselves to be able to play that role in their own system. And so sometimes you're enacting like wounds with archetypal figures or primary caregivers. Sometimes you are the compassionate, grounded presence within a client's system that they need to have modeled for them before they can do it for themselves. Does that make sense, Heidi? Okay.
Thanks so much. Our next question says, really appreciating question. This question is hard to ask via text, but I'm going to try. Related to what you said about poor history of consent equals poor relationship to choice, I'm also thinking about when you mentioning a white person and working with non-white people and there being a power dynamic. So I'm wondering what it would look like for you/white people to not assert that as universal truth, but rather let the other person tell you if that's what they perceive. I ask this because I, as a Black person, I don't see white people as having power over me. White supremacy, sure. And there are many public intellectuals, Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, who feel the first step to ending white supremacy is to stop claiming that position as true.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to see, I'll read this real quick. Okay, thank you for that question. I appreciate you bringing that up and naming that. Yes, absolutely, you're correct. And the thing that needs to be talked about from my perspective is the power dynamics in society that are moving through the space that we're trained in, right? And so that's something that can come up in the situation. I actually think specifically is more on the person, like for me, is on me in the room, and is naming that this is something that I'm trained into. My white supremacy tells me this. And so this could come up in the room. And that's part of that consenting to risk, is that I could play out this dynamic in our relationship and being able to talk about what work has been done there to allow the person, the client in that position, to consent to if I'm somebody who's safe enough for them to work with. And not to say that that is true, because it's not true. And that's something that we're trying to dismantle in that relationship. And I hope that answers your question. I'm super open for follow-up question or feedback too, if you want to put it in the Q&A box.
I might chime in with a question here. I'm wondering if you can speak to how to work with shame when it comes into the room. And so whether that's around, shame that a client might have in having to request touch and just what that's like, or if you do set a boundary as the therapist in the room and the client is experiencing rejection and shame from that, like how you might work through that with them.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. That's a really good question. Shame is, if you're working with people with trauma, it's always there. I think, well, and all of us have trauma, so all of us have some shame work to do. Yeah, and so it's a piece of why I think practicing is so important ahead of time, because you can really slow it down. And that if you're like that really slowed down practice, it feels awkward as hell for most clients, to be honest. And I kind of like joke about it. And I'm like, this is going to be really weird, but we're going to do this thing and it's going to feel funky, but like go with me on it and let's just see what happens. And being able to slow it down to the point where it's like, okay, what is happening for you when I say, we're going to do a thing now where you request it? And even noticing if a client like can't do it, great. There's so much work to do there in your prep session then. And for me, like, I haven't said this, but I think way more prep is needed than is done in research sessions that is, typically required in some of these protocols, especially with people with trauma histories, because our relationships aren't at the point of safety to be able to hold this stuff with 1 or 2 prep sessions. And there's a lot of work on the front end around things exactly like shame that we can do to set somebody up to be able to access more of the benefit of the medicine if we've done that work ahead of time, and it makes integration a lot easier as well if someone has done the prep work. So really with shame, my biggest thing is just slow down. slow down and notice what's happening and don't blow past it, and actually create room for the shame narrative to be spoken. Shame can't exist when it's seen. Shame exists in isolation, and serves to perpetuate isolation from ourselves and other people. And so if we can actually draw out the part of a client who is holding that shame, ask them what their story is, what's the narrative that's going on, and really like look at it together and be with it and allow the body to process through whatever the somatic feelings are, whatever the energy is, whatever the movements that come with it. Typically that helps calm it down and create trust within the relationship. And another piece of it is I'll often ask the client to tell me what is it they think I'm thinking about them. Shame often comes with those narratives of like, they're thinking it's so weird that I want this, or they're thinking that I have cold, clammy hand, whatever it is, whatever the projected story is. I'll say like, what do you think that is happening for me right now? Like, can you tell me what that narrative is? And then let's talk about it. And I can tell you if that's true or not. Let's test it out. And oftentimes that is terrifying for people to name out loud. And as they get used to it more, it can dismantle the grip that shame has on them. And they're able to show up more authentically in a relationship. That answer your question, Brooke?
That was an excellent answer. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And we have another question in the Q&A. Is the effect of the drug triggering the client, or are you integrating exposure therapy / having them discuss experiences that were traumatic while they are under the influence of the drug?
Yeah, mostly it's in most of these trainings it's called the inner healing intelligence, but really it's just like the client and their, we all have an innate capacity for healing. That is what's driving it. And that's in combination with the medicine, in combination with the prep work that we've done, intentions, et cetera, et cetera. For me, I don't like push someone to process something ever. In the MAPS protocol, they say there's an agreement in there. I think it's like, if they haven't brought up the thing that they want to process within, I think it's the first hour. I can't remember. If somebody else knows, tell me. But if it's like they haven't brought it up, they agree that the therapist can ask about it. And that's something that's agreed to ahead of time. People have different perspectives about that. I really trust the client process, and I really trust the body and the psyche and the whole system moving at the pace that it needs to. And if someone has set an intention to come in to work on something, it's going to come up. And if it doesn't come up, there is so much room for processing around what is happening that thing didn't come up, that they have spent a ton of time and energy and money trying to work on. And doing the work with whatever the resistance or the protectors are that are getting in the way from that happening is an incredibly important part of the process and should not be rushed. From a parts work and IFS perspective, we have to work with protectors first in order to get consensual access to inner children, to traumatized parts. And if we blow past the protectors that sometimes show up as resistance, sometimes show up as not feeling the effects of anything, sometimes show up as just like not wanting to talk about the trauma that they're there to process, we need to work with that. And if we can't get consent from the parts of us that are there to protect us from our trauma, to access the trauma, then we're not in consensual relationship with the whole client system. So a lot of times this means slowing down and just working bit by bit with whatever's coming up, and not pushing, because if we push, then we're going to rupture something, and that's not what we're there to do.
It also reminds me of how in the MAPS training, one of the reasons they feel like you need 3 medicine sessions is that they were surprised that the index trauma, or the trauma that the person has PTSD associated with, isn't usually the first to come out, and that people process earlier different traumas, and that might happen on the second or third session. Can you intimated a little bit talking about the protectors. Do you think that there's a reason why the earlier childhood rooted traumas might come out more than what they think of as this, maybe the worst thing that ever happened to them?
Yeah, lots of different perspectives around that. Let me see. I want to answer that for a moment. Yeah, so I think that oftentimes the childhood stuff ends up coming up instead of the like horrible thing that happened in adulthood, is because trauma builds on each other, and that something we experience in adulthood is going to be impacted by the training, the programming, the trauma that we've experienced in childhood. And specifically with MDMA, it just like shoots to the root of the issue. And so, processing something about, I didn't feel loved as a kid by my parent, working through that is going to impact everything that's stacked on top of it. It's called the bottom up approach to trauma healing versus a top down approach. Top down is where we like go from the most recent and go down, or work on like external coping skills and hope that trickles down. Bottom up is what's at the root. Let's pull something up by the root, and that's going to dislodge the whole system that's attached to it. And so that's also why I say we have to go really slow, because the protectors are all in place to protect you from getting to the root so that thing doesn't happen again. I would also say that, and again, this is just my perspective, other people will think different things, is that specifically with MDMA, it's such an attachment focused medicine, that attachment work is often what comes up in that space. And the way that we attach to other humans, because we're social creatures, we're meant to be in relationship, and healing happens in relationship. That's the work that oftentimes needs to be done to be able to manage and navigate maybe the PTSD from something that happened more recently in life. Maybe someone's PTSD is really lodged in because they're isolated and can't connect to community, can't be vulnerable. And that wound is based in something from childhood. And so working that gives them space to work on whatever it is that's coming up now and access resources of community and care and all that sort of stuff from a different place. It's just my thoughts. Yeah.
That's super. I really love this conversation. And if nobody else has a question right now, I'd like to jump in with another one. One of the things that I think about a lot with consent and psychedelic medicine is that the demand is not going to be met, the supply is not going to be there to meet the demand. And so it is very likely that people desperate for access to psychedelic therapy will come into a setting where, like, if they have any choice, they have one choice. And that may not be the person that they would want to do psychedelic therapy with, but that would be the person who says, I will do psychedelic therapy with you. And what about when there's like a mismatch with that? I mean, certainly, in helping people, I love access mental health services in the United States. I would say it's more often a mismatch than it is a match. And you have to move forward with it because it's all you have. It's your only choice. And like, what does that look like in a place where you're going to go to such vulnerability and non-ordinary states of consciousness? And how can we work with that? And how can we be ethical as practitioners with that?
That's a huge question, Heidi. And my first answer is, I don't know. So we're going to start from that point. I don't know. My best guess is, I have a couple of things come to mind. One is that I'd really love to see a lot of education for clients, a lot of education around empowering clients of what does an ethical practitioner look like and how do you ask for what you need from practitioners. I think a lot of people go in to those kind of situations and just being like, well, this is what I got and I don't get to ask for anything. I just have to accept whatever's being given. And I think there is room for clients to advocate for themselves and set boundaries. And that if someone isn't like a violently unethical practitioner, hopefully they'll be able to work with them in that space. And so I want to see a lot of work around empowering clients and also like educating clients on what safety looks like so that they know if a practitioner is doing something that isn't safe, that they have a sense of, oh, actually, this isn't okay. And if they're being gaslit or something like that, like there's actual support from that other end as well. So I'd love to see that. I think I'm very like pro dismantling hierarchy around licenses in the healthcare system. And so I think that it's really important to create access points that are in the healthcare system and also outside of the healthcare system. And so looking at things like peer support spaces and access through decriminalization, religious use, all that sort of stuff. That might be, I don't know if that's controversial for this community, but really it's like, how do we empower as many people as possible with these skills? You don't have to be a licensed therapist to be a good psychedelic sitter. And, insurance companies and all those things, and people with a lot of mental health issues do need people with higher training, but wanting to expand the net of who can practice this to give people more access across the board, right? So the people who don't need a really highly trained social worker are able to find care somewhere else, and they're not taking that away from someone who does need that kind of care. So I would say that piece. And I think there's the reality that, like we don't have enough training for people right now, which means that people are going to get harmed. And I think that we need to have really strong accountability systems set up before we release people into the wild. It's a really big problem that I personally am seeing in Oregon right now, is there's no accountability system set up. I'm advocating for that pretty strongly right now. And I think that that's a really necessary piece of ethics, of having a system of what does it look like to actually support clients when they are harmed, rather than just replicating the punitive justice system of taking someone's license away, but offering no support for the person that was harmed, and not offering no kind of like restorative justice model around working with the client and practitioner towards some type of healing. So I don't have a solve for that, but those are the ideas I've got.
Well, I also, thinking back what you were talking about earlier about like, is this for me or is this for them? It makes me think how important it is to have communities of providers that are in community with one another, so that you can have an explicit conversation saying, I might not be the person for you, and I want you to know that I am committed to helping you find somebody who can be if I'm not, that this isn't like a one choice that you have. Because I do think that in mental health today, people often don't feel like they have a lot of choices. And maybe we can help with that too, by having a strong community of people that we can say, tell me what would be better for you. Tell me what would be a better fit. But I really appreciate your answer. I know that other people have questions, so I'll stop talking.
Thank you so much. Our next question we have is a follow-up question relating to parts and consent. Would you ask for consent with protectors during the preparation time? How might you handle this? Or if you are seeking an exile part present during the session, would you ask for consent at that time?
Yeah, let me read that question myself, just because my brain missed a part of it. For consent with protectors. Okay, so this part of this is like, we're not going in being like, okay, protector, consent. It's more about like, who's here, who's coming up, what's present. So there's a lot of attunement in the moment. And that our client system are going to tell you where they're at, right? If somebody is like, if someone comes in and they're like, I'm really anxious about this, I don't really know, I don't really trust you, like, who are you? You automatically know, cool, there's a protector here, and now we're going to work with this. We're going to work with the anxiety. We're going to work with, let's talk about what you don't trust about me. What does that mean? What do you need? Et cetera, et cetera. So working with whatever arises. If an exile part comes up and you haven't had any contact with protectors, you can do two things. You can check in and say, hey, I just want to check in with the whole system. Is there any other parts in here that aren't okay with us talking about this right now? That's one thing you can do. You can also go with it. You can trust that the client system is bringing up what needs to be brought up and was what okay to be brought up. And also know that, specifically with MDMA and psilocybin, is that they do decrease protector energy. And that if you have, you're going to be talking to protectors in the preparation session, they're part of typically the presenting consciousness of the client. So doing all these consent activities is you building a relationship with protectors. And so if something is coming up during the session, you get to decide how much trust you want to have with the client system, that is allowed if there isn't protectors just coming up first. And again, you can always just do a quick check.
Thank you. Our next question is on the topic of not feeling the substance as a sign the individual's defenses are too rigid. Do you recommend that the individual does more trauma work through traditional talk therapy first? What other avenues do you recommend?
Yeah, I just want to say first that like someone not feeling it does not always mean it's rigidity. It just can mean that sometimes. There's lots of different reasons why people don't experience the impact of something. So just saying this is one of a plethora of reasons in this specific situation, if that's what's happening. Let me just read this again because my brain just lost it while I was talking. Do you recommend? Okay. Typically, I recommend more trauma work ahead of time and more relational building of that. What I've seen is that that's mostly about the relationship, which means that all of their attachment trauma is getting played out with me. And so we need to work on some kind of relationship building together to get the client to a place where they're comfortable with it. And that might not happen, and that's okay. And I might not be the person for them, in which case we need to refer and find someone who's a better fit. A lot of times I talk to people about the concept of self-consent, and particularly with parts work, IFS, and the wheel of consent that we talked about, one part might be consenting and another part is not consenting. I mean, every one of us has experienced this. Part of me wants to do this, part of me doesn't want to do that. That gets expanded with trauma in many ways. And we'll even see that like with traumatic experiences that people had. Part of me wanted to go do this thing with this person, part of me didn't. I abandoned and neglected and maybe played out my early attachment wounding internally and ignored the no that was coming up in my own body, did something, and now there's a consent rupture internally. We might need to work that first to get to a place where all the parts can be on board with consenting to what's happening before the system is really open to the medicine. That's just one example of something that can happen. And there's lots of other spaces too, but yeah, so typically recommend more prep work with a person specifically focused on attachment and the concept of self-consent and what's going on with the parts internally.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our next question is, I'd love to hear more about this community's thoughts on cross-discipline ethics accountability, not only social workers or licensed folks, but religious and community/peer access practitioners as well.
I think that interdisciplinary work around accountability and consultation is absolutely necessary. I think that we learn from each other in these spaces, and no one discipline within the field has all the answers. No one person has all the answers. And the best, from my opinion, the best way to actually support accountability is from a community perspective, and that needs to be a diverse community. Because if we're in an accountability group with people who are all practicing the same ways as us, that have the same identities as us, that means that there's going to be blind spots that all of us share that's not going to be caught by anybody. And we're not going to be in a space of being able to actually like check each other and balance each other out. So I hope to see as much interdisciplinary work as possible. And again, I think that also we need to do a lot of work around dismantling the hierarchy of licensed practitioners versus unlicensed practitioners in our space.
There's probably some overlap in this answer with the revoked consent piece that you spoke of, but if a client did say that they feel that they had been violated in some way, can you maybe talk about like what would be the best way to navigate that situation as the provider?
Yeah, is that like in the session, like someone's still on the medicine and they're saying you violated me in some way, or is it afterwards?
I almost kind of could say, I could almost say for both, but for the sake of time, however you think is, yeah, however you want to answer.
Yeah, and I want to start by again just naming this is just my opinion, and a lot of people are going to have other thoughts on this. And a lot of people probably have better answers than I do. So if it's happening during, I think that well, let me back up for a moment. The first thing that needs to happen is that practitioners, we need to do our own work to be in a place to receive feedback without getting defensive and dismissive. And that is incredibly important. I know a lot of people that have been harmed, particularly in some underground spaces, by practitioners being really dismissive of feedback. And that's a very real thing that happens a lot. And so doing our own work around our trauma histories, around what our relationship is to power, what our relationship is to being seen as the expert in the room, we got to like work and unlearn that shit so that we can actually be present and receive that if it's happening, because we are all very capable of harming people. And if we're not in awareness of what our shadow is, it's going to come out. And so we need to know what it looks like and what it feels like, and also know that we're going to miss things and we're going to fuck up. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this thing. And so I think that, like, for me, that's the backdrop of that has to be there first. And no one's going to be perfect in that. It's something we all just need to commit to working on and have accountability with our peers and in communities that people will call us in and point things out when we're missing spots and when our shadow's showing up. But I think that if it's like happening in the room, I think the first thing to do is to stop, acknowledge it, talk about it, and be in a space of being able to own that that is real for the person. Like whether or not you think you actually did something, it doesn't matter. If the client is experiencing that, you need to be able to acknowledge like you're experiencing harm right now. And I'm a piece of that. And that's either getting projected onto me or I did something. And I think when you're in the medicine space is not the time to start figuring out, did this actually happen or not? It's the time to say, this is real for you right now. It's the same thing as when people talk about, like, if someone starts having God hallucinations or whatever else, it doesn't matter if it's real or not for the therapist. It's real for the person and we need to go with it. And so being able to talk about what do they need If they feel like I've done something to harm them, does that need to be, do they need an apology? Do they need ownership? What do they need? And how does that back up against my own limits? Like, I'm not going to own something, doing something really grotesque and horrible if I see myself as not doing that. If that is something that's being, saying that happened, then we need to bring other people in, and that's a much bigger process. But if there is space, being able to actually negotiate with a client, figure out what's needed, sometimes I think that can be a space where you have the chance to recapitulate a traumatic experience someone had and do it differently. I also think it's a space where microaggressions can happen frequently, and that we need to be able to acknowledge that and make a commitment to either processing it in the moment or processing during integration, and then doing check-ins around safety of client being willing to continue with us. And if that's something where we need to use that safety plan that we made with a support person or whatever else that looked like. If it comes up during an integration session, I think there's a lot more room in that because someone isn't in an expanded state. And so we can talk a lot more about what happened, what do we need. If we need to have outside support brought in, then that absolutely needs to happen. If we need, a restorative justice facilitator, if we need a witness of some sort, if we need supervision, whatever that person needs to feel safe navigating through that is what needs to be prioritized. And that I would say the practitioner needs to get their own support too, both to be able to process their feelings that are coming up around it, their own defensiveness, so that they can come to the client conversation more grounded, having their stuff processed first, and to be able to just support us, because it's hard to go through that kind of stuff, and not having support around it is going to make us show up worse and is actually creates higher likelihood that we will do something again. That's my best answer, Brooke, but I don't have a perfect answer for you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, great answer for sure. Our next question is Kylia Taylor's book, The Ethics of Caring, still the gold standard reference book on the topic?
Yeah, so Kylia's book is definitely still one of the gold standards. I would say that that is amazing for like individual focused ethics and caring around this work. A lot of my work, is influenced by her, and she's amazing. Her book doesn't really cover like systemic issues around ethics and consent and power and oppression. So just to say that it's more focused on the individual, and she does a fantastic job of really breaking down like the different ethical aspects of practitioners and how we can get drawn into unethical behavior and what it looks like to do shadow work. So absolutely highly recommend that. As far as I know, there's not another like big book around it, but there's tons of articles all over online about this, and lots of resources in different places. Just you can Google it.
Next question is, can you speak to ethics and consent in group journey settings?
Yeah, my favorite. I'm a big group person. I love groups. I think healing happens in community. And yeah, it looks a little different, similar but different. I think that with groups, the practitioner needs to have individual meet points with all of the people involved, whether it's a phone call or a full session. It depends on the nature of the group that you're working with. And then my perspective is there needs to be group preparation sessions together. In retreat settings, that often looks different, of like day of, day before. In more therapy sessions, sometimes there's more like an arc, a longer process with preparation. And there needs to be group agreements made. So having space to talk about how does consent move through the group container, who's present, going through those same things, like what do power dynamics look like, what kind of touch is available in the group space, and then really doing a lot of work around empowering people to be able to be in their own place of consent if something does come up in between participants. And also practitioner needs to be in a place of knowing how many people they can hold, well, being really clear that it's comfortable for them to be able to hold interactions that are happening between clients. If you don't feel like you can hold the whole space, then there needs to be more people in the room. And I would say always at least 2 facilitators with groups, unless it's like a super tiny group, but usually they're a little bit bigger. And I will say that there's increased risk with groups, like there just is, because there's more people in the room. And so that's part of the consent process, is talking about the risks that are present and making sure that everyone's aware of what it is that they're consenting to, and also what happens if consent agreements or ethical standards are violated and where people go for that.
Thank you. And I actually have a quick follow-up question to that. how would you know if somebody wasn't in a state to be able to consent in group settings, since it might be harder to miss those signs in, group situations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think that in group settings, there is more trust that practitioners have to have in clients to be able to advocate for themselves, because you're not bedside. Like, I can't be watching the movement of someone's nervous system every moment of the session. And so a lot of people who do group work will have a certain standard of like where the client is in their healing journey, how many medicine sessions they've done before, like have they had an individual session with them. I know some practitioners that won't do groups with anybody who they haven't had individual sessions with, to know that they can like handle themselves in the space. And there's a big range with that. Like, some people are really comfortable having novices in there, and that's okay too. I have a higher standard around that personally, because I want to prioritize safety, especially because I work with people who have a lot of trauma. But yeah, it really depends.
And our next question here is, can you speak to more details about the support person / plan?
Sure. Yeah. So again, this looks different for everybody. And this is just how I've done it, because nobody who trained me had a good answer for how we do this when other folks were asking. And this is what some people in my community we've come up with. So essentially what we say is we talk to people about like, okay, if you totally revoke consent for this while it's happening, what we typically offer is that we want you to have somebody who can be here within 20 minutes, who's kind of like on call if you need them. Typically it's the person who was planning to pick them up anyways, but sometimes it's different people. And there is, there's a resource piece around this too, of having somebody that is available, can come up against resource issues. So there's a lot to navigate through here. And some people don't have somebody, maybe we're going to call Fireside, there's lots of different things to do. But just talking through, for me, with a support person, of somebody who can be here, who you feel comfortable with sitting with you in this place instead of me. If I'm the only practitioner and they're not, if they get to a place of not feeling safe with having me in the room. And so again, what my policy typically is with this is sitting outside the door. The spaces that I work with medicine, there's always other people nearby in the building. I'm never alone with a client in the space. There's somebody really nearby. That's a safety thing with other practitioners. And so sitting outside the door, having the door open and having a support person come. I've never had this happen to the extreme. I've had people have wanting their support person come early, and not because I did something that made them feel unsafe, but because they wanted that person to be the person that was with them as they were coming down. And that was pre-negotiated and totally fine. So again, I haven't had to like super intensely enact this. I know other people who have, but I think it's important to have it planned just in case you do need to enact it, if that does come up with people. And I'd be super curious if other people like have other ways they handle this. Please let me know. I'm always looking for more resources of how we do this, because I don't think our community at large has really answered this question yet.
Awesome. We have just a minute left. I'm wondering if I can ask one quick question before we wrap up. What does your documentation look like? Like, do you have specific informed consent form that bullets these out, or how do you, record keep it?
Yeah, I mean, that like checklist I have printed out and go through it with people. I don't have like a formal form that has everyone's answers to everything on it, but we are writing everything down, and it's like a living document that the client and I both have access to. In like the Oregon system, there's some things that have to be specifically documented in writing with people. And some of those things are similar to things that are on the checklist that we went through with some nuances. And so again, it's up to like, what are the regulations of the space that you're working with? What are the regulations and community norms? And what do you and your client need in order to feel like this is held in a really consensual container?
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for everything this evening. That was really such a great presentation and discussion afterwards.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. And thank you everyone for your questions.
Take care. Have a good night. Bye, everybody.